The smell of bacon, the clink of silverware, the quiet hum of a jukebox playing an old country tune. On the surface, it was just another morning in Eagles Ridge. But beneath the calm, something was brewing, something no one in town saw coming. Sarah Mitchell had been up since dawn, her internal clock still synced to the rhythm of combat zones half a world away. Her steps were silent, deliberate, as she guided her father through the front doors of Betty's Home Cooking, a little diner nestled at the heart of town, and the only place that still felt untouched by the years they'd spent at war. She didn't flinch when the bell above the door jingled. She didn't need to look to know exactly who was inside. She had memorized every corner, every regular, every possible exit. That was just how her mind worked now. James Mitchell, tall and straight-backed despite the cane in his hand and the darkness in his eyes, paused for only a second at the threshold. He didn't need sight to know where he was. He could smell the cinnamon rolls warming in the oven, feel the familiar vibration of the squeaky floorboard just left of center, hear Betty's familiar voice calling out from behind the counter. "Morning, you two. Coffee's hot." The way she said it, casual and bright, hid the fact that she always made sure their table was clear, their booth set just the way James liked it, back to the wall, facing the door, even if he couldn't see it. Sarah led her father to their usual spot, guiding him with the kind of care that looked effortless, but wasn't. She positioned his coffee at 3 o'clock, toast at 1, just like he preferred, and folded the napkin twice, corner tucked precisely under the plate. Military precision wrapped in daughterly devotion. James reached out with one hand, fingers grazing the edge of the table, then finding the spoon. He smiled, faint and warm. "You don't have to do this every morning, sweetheart. The shelter needs you more than I do." Sarah didn't look up. She was already scanning the room, watching the way Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop clutched her handbag, how Mike the postal worker shook out his newspaper. Normal, predictable, safe. "The shelter can wait," she replied, eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. "This is our time." Betty shuffled over, refilling their coffee with a practiced hand. "Got your wheat toast, James?" "Extra crispy." He nodded in thanks, his hand finding the edge of the saucer before the cup. Sarah watched the exchange, noting the slight tremor in Betty's hand. Age, not fear, and the way the other diners offered half smiles without getting too close. Everyone knew James Mitchell, decorated Marine, Navy Cross, lost his sight to an IED while saving 5 of his men. Everyone respected him, and most were a little in awe of the woman who sat beside him, the one who never spoke much about her own service, but moved like someone who'd faced down more than anyone in town could imagine. Outside, the early autumn breeze rustled fallen leaves across the pavement. The sun hadn't fully climbed yet, casting long shadows across the glass front of the diner. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Sarah sipped her coffee, but her posture never relaxed. Even here, in the safest place she knew, the part of her trained to anticipate trouble never really shut off. She wasn't paranoid, she was prepared, because the world didn't give second chances to people who didn't stay sharp. Her father leaned back slightly in the booth, lifting his face toward the warmth of the morning light. "Feels like a good day," he said. Sarah didn't respond right away. Something about the way the wind shifted outside made her glance toward the door. It was nothing, just a breeze. But still, she didn't answer. Not yet. She'd learned a long time ago that peace was always temporary, that silence could be the space between two storms, that danger often wore the face of calm until the mask slipped. And deep in her gut, she knew something was about to change. Eagles Ridge didn't know it yet, but before this day ended, it would never be the same again. The sound came slow at first, a low rumble barely louder than the wind curling through the alleyways and over the tin rooftops of Eagles Ridge. Most people didn't notice it. They kept sipping their coffee, chatting about high school football scores, leaf cleanup, and who was going to get elected to the town council next month. But Sarah heard it. She felt it in her bones before it reached her ears, before it spilled down the streets like a storm cloud with a growl. her head lifted slightly, eyes narrowing, gaze fixing on the horizon beyond the diner's windows. The vibrations crept through the floor before they hit the glass. Her fingers tightened slightly around her coffee cup. Her father didn't need to ask. He heard it too. He turned his head, not quite toward the sound, but toward her. "Motorcycles?" he asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer, not at first. She was already counting. 1 engine, then 3, then more. The throb of custom pipes and oversized engines wasn't something you could mistake for anything else. Not locals, not tourists. This wasn't a Sunday ride through the hills. It was a statement, a declaration, a message wrapped in chrome and leather and exhaust. Across the diner, conversation began to slow, then pause altogether. Even Betty's hand stopped mid-pour over a mug at the far counter. The low noise was now unmistakable, building like thunder rolling down Main Street, getting closer, louder, heavier. The regulars turned in their seats. Mrs. Henderson reached for her purse. Mike folded his paper with deliberate slowness, as if not wanting to draw attention. Only Sarah and James remained still. Then they appeared. Through the wide front windows, they came into view like something out of another world. Bikes gleaming in the morning sun, black leather jackets worn like armor, heavy boots planted with intent. The lead rider slowed first, a monstrous Harley with a jagged chrome wolf painted on the tank. Behind him came others, fanning out, engines snarling. 15, maybe more. Sarah had seen this before. Not in small-town diners, but in convoys barreling through war zones. The choreography of intimidation, the show of force meant to unnerve, to dominate. She watched as the first kickstand dropped, then another, then another. The sound of boots hitting pavement followed, measured, deliberate, like a beat to a song no one wanted to hear. James adjusted the grip on his cane. "They're not locals," he said, almost a question, but not really. Sarah kept her voice calm, level, number not even close. The first one through the door was Axel Cross, head of the Night Riders, a gang whose name alone carried enough weight to silence conversations from one side of the state to the other. His walk was arrogant, slow, like he owned the place just by entering it. His eyes scanned the room, not missing a thing. His face was hard and angular, a deep scar dragging across his jaw like a warning label. The leather cut on his back bore the Night Rider's insignia in bold, blood-red stitching. Demon skull, spiked wings. Below it, a small patch read, "President." He was followed by Stryker, taller, heavier, his arms like steel cables under his cut, fingers twitching as if they always wanted to be making fists. Then came Hawk, lean and sharp-eyed. Ghost, silent as his name, his expression blank but watching everything, and Blade, carrying a smirk that never touched his eyes. They moved like a unit without trying. This wasn't just a gang, it was an army. The diner fell into a silence so thick it seemed to steal the oxygen from the room. Betty stood frozen behind the counter, her fingers still curled around the coffee pot. Mike looked down. Mrs. Henderson gripped her handbag with white knuckles. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The air turned dense with tension, the kind that vibrates behind your ribs. Axel's eyes settled on Sarah and James, his lip curled with a smile that wasn't really a smile. "Didn't know they let blind men out without a leash," he said, his voice rich with mockery, sharpened with venom. James didn't flinch. Sarah's hand moved, just slightly, touching his wrist. It looked like comfort, but it wasn't. It was control. Her father's temper had gotten the better of him once or twice, but not today, not now. "The breakfast specials are on the board," she said, her tone flat, cold. "Order something or move along." Axel's eyes lit up like he'd just found a toy with a hidden switch. "You got a mouth on you, sweetheart," he said, stepping closer. The rest of the gang fanned out through the diner, taking seats, leaning against walls, blocking exits without ever needing to be told. They didn't need weapons drawn to make a threat. Their presence alone was enough. Sarah's mind was already working, mapping out escape routes, calculating the reach of a coffee pot. noting how close Betty was to the fire extinguisher behind the counter. Anything could be a weapon if she needed it to be, anything could be a shield, but that wasn't the plan. Not yet. James finally spoke, his voice calm and low. "My daughter's not afraid of you, son, and neither am I." Axel turned his gaze to the older man, eyes narrowing slightly. Brave talk for someone who can't see who he's dealing with. "No," Sarah said quietly, "you're the one who can't see." Axel stepped forward again, eyes locked on hers. Behind him, Hawk shifted, Stryker tensed. Blade cracked his knuckles like he was hoping someone would give him an excuse, but Sarah just sat still, unbothered, eyes steady, like she'd been in this position before, because she had. Dozens of times, different places, same energy, men trying to control a room through volume, threat, presence. It never impressed her. She'd stood in front of warlords with murder in their eyes and a finger on a trigger. The Night Riders thought they were here to intimidate a blind man and his daughter. What they didn't realize was they were standing in a room with someone who'd faced down worse than all of them put together, and they were about to find out just how badly they'd miscalculated. Axel leaned forward, his gloved hand resting on the edge of their table, his presence casting a long shadow over the booth where Sarah and James sat. His smirk deepened, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Curiosity mixed with challenge, like he was waiting to see if Sarah would flinch. She didn't. She didn't even blink. Her expression remained unreadable, the calm mask of someone who had spent too many nights under fire to be shaken by a man who mistook loudness for power. Axel's voice dropped a register, trying to sound more dangerous than he already looked. "Tell me, little nurse," he said, the words slow and deliberate. "You talk that brave to everyone, or just to guys who could snap you in half?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence between them spoke louder than anything she could have said. It was the kind of silence that made men like Axel uncomfortable, not because it was weak, but because it wasn't. She reached across the table again, her hand brushing James's arm, but it wasn't out of concern. It was the signal, a code they'd practiced in case things ever went wrong. James's fingers tightened ever so slightly around his cane. He still hadn't moved, still hadn't turned toward Axel, but Sarah could see the lines in his face shift. Not fear, focus. Old instincts waking up after a long sleep. Axel didn't notice. He was too caught up in his performance. "Look around, sweetheart," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the rest of the diner, where his men now stood like sentinels, casual in posture, but deliberate in placement. "We're everywhere. You think the cops are going to ride in here and save your little family breakfast?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice into something that tried to sound intimate, but came off like a warning. "They don't come around much anymore. This is Night Riders' territory now." Sarah's fingers moved slowly, sliding toward the pocket of her jacket. She didn't look at the phone, didn't need to. She knew the feel of it, the weight of it, the way her thumb would rest exactly over the one number that changed everything. The call she never wanted to make, the one she had always hoped could stay buried in the silence of her past. Because once it was made, there was no going back, no hiding, no peace, just old debts being collected in ways most people couldn't even imagine. She took a breath, not fear, not hesitation, just control, and glanced toward the windows. Outside, the motorcycles still glistened in the sun, a line of chrome and black leather stretching across the parking lot like a wall. 15, number closer to 20. Some of the bikes she didn't recognize from the first count. More had arrived. A show of force, clearly, meant to intimidate, but all it did was confirm her math. She'd faced worse with fewer allies. James spoke again, his voice low but steady, cutting through Axel's bravado like a scalpel. "Son," he said, "the only territory you have is what decent people let you take through fear. And some of us aren't afraid anymore." The words settled like dust over silence. Even the gang members shifted slightly. Stryker's hand moved just enough to rest near his waistband. Hawk scanned the room like he was recalculating options. Ghost didn't move at all. but his eyes had narrowed and Blade cracked his neck with a tight jerk, as if waiting for a signal. Axel chuckled, but it was forced now, brittle at the edges. "You think you're heroes?" he asked, stepping back a half pace. "You think just 'cause you got some history and some medals, we're supposed to be impressed?" His tone turned mocking, but it rang a little too loud, like he was trying to convince himself as much as everyone else. "We run this town now. You're just a broken old man and a girl with a death wish." Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, her voice came soft, even, like it was the start of a countdown. "Last chance," she said, meeting Axel's gaze without blinking. "Order something, or leave." Her thumb slipped into her jacket pocket and rested on the phone. Just a touch, not a call. Not yet. Axel scoffed, but behind him the atmosphere had shifted. Some of his crew looked uncertain now. Not all of them were lifers. A few still had the posture of men who had once worn a uniform, who recognized something familiar in the way Sarah sat straight and still, the way James spoke like a man used to command. Axel either didn't notice or didn't care. He was locked into a narrative, one where fear always won, where strength was loud, and where he was always the biggest presence in the room. He reached out. His hand moved toward James, fingers stretching toward the dark glasses. Maybe it was just a threat. Maybe he was going to knock them off or just get a reaction. But he never got the chance. Sarah's voice cut through the space like a blade. "Touch him," she said, her tone colder than the steel she'd once flown through enemy fire, "and you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you hadn't." Axel froze. Just for a moment. Just long enough. It wasn't just the words. It was what lived behind them. Something in her eyes stopped him cold, something he hadn't expected. He saw it then, saw what others only caught glimpses of. She wasn't bluffing. She wasn't rattled. She was choosing not to act, not because she couldn't, but because she hadn't needed to. Yet. Outside, the wind picked up again, stirring the flags on the motorcycles. A whisper of movement through town. Inside the diner, nobody breathed. Sarah's thumb pressed down on the phone screen. 1 second, one signal, one call. And the war Axel had just started was about to find him entirely unprepared. Sarah's thumb hovered for less than a second before it made contact. No hesitation, no second guessing, just a quiet practice touch. The phone didn't beep, didn't vibrate. The screen lit up, the call connected, and on the other end, thousands of miles and a few lifetimes away, a voice answered that hadn't spoken to her in years. "Mitchell?" it said, deep and coarse, like gravel under a tank tread. "It's Sarah," she replied, calm, controlled, the tension in her muscles locked down tight. "I'm at Betty's. We've got a situation." There was a pause, brief, not surprised, just calculating. Then, "Is this the one?" Sarah's eyes didn't leave Axel, who had taken a small step back, maybe without realizing it, maybe instinctively reacting to a shift he couldn't name. "This is the one," she said. Colonel Jack Morrison didn't ask another question. He didn't need details. Didn't need to know how many bikers were outside, or what kind of threat they posed. When Sarah Mitchell called in a favor, it wasn't over coffee and nostalgia, it was because someone had crossed a line they wouldn't be able to uncross. 10 minutes, Morrison said. "Don't start without us." She ended the call, quietly slid the phone back into her jacket pocket. The air in the diner was still thick, but it had changed. Something unspoken had shifted. The way the wind smells before lightning, the heaviness that comes before a first drop of rain. Axel didn't notice it, but a few of his men did. Hawk's eyes narrowed just slightly. Ghost looked toward the front windows. Stryker leaned into a wall like he needed something to hold him steady. They didn't know what was coming, but they knew something was. And whatever it wasn't going to come softly. James turned his head slightly, his hand tightening around the cane, not in fear, but readiness. "You made the call," he said, a statement, not a question. Sarah nodded once, her eyes locked on Axel. "I gave them a chance." Her voice wasn't angry, it wasn't loud. It was the kind of calm that only exists right before things fall apart or come together in ways no one expects. Through the windows, the wind had picked up. The row of bikes outside shimmered in the sunlight, their polished chrome glinting like teeth. The streets were still quiet, but not for long, because 10 minutes is an eternity when you're waiting, and not nearly enough when you're not ready. Axel tried to regain the momentum. He was used to dominance, used to people backing down, and something about the silence unnerved him. "That's supposed to scare me?" he sneered, jabbing a thumb toward the window. "Who you gonna call? The church choir? Your knitting group?" He was trying to laugh, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. He didn't like not knowing, didn't like the way Sarah's composure held firm when most people would have cracked. "No," she said, her voice low and razor-sharp. "I called the people who know what real fear looks like. The kind you don't walk away from. The kind you earn the hard way." Betty, still frozen behind the counter, finally moved, slowly stepping back toward the kitchen, as if remembering that the fire extinguisher was right where she'd always kept it. She didn't know what was coming, but something in Sarah's tone told her she wouldn't want to be caught in the open when it arrived. Mike the postman stood up quietly and eased toward the back. Mrs. Henderson clutched her purse tighter, her eyes darting to the door. Nobody ran, but nobody wanted to stay seated either. Axel's mouth opened to reply, but before the words could come, they heard it, faint at first, then louder, not like the night rider's arrival, a chaotic snarl of mismatched engines and testosterone. This sound was different, controlled, rhythmic, purposeful, a formation, not a parade, the kind of sound that came from machines operated by people who had drilled for this, trained for this, lived for moments like this. Sarah turned her head slowly toward the window, and a ghost of a smile played at the corners of her mouth, not from amusement, but from recognition. The cavalry wasn't coming. It was already here. Down the street they emerged. First 2 bikes, then 6, then a dozen. Rolling in tight formation, headlights glowing against the sun's glare, their riders in black leather, but not like the gang outside. These riders didn't wear loud patches or skulls. They wore subdued insignias, small unit pins, Marine Corps emblems, Special Forces tabs, a quiet display of history written in combat stitching. They didn't rev their engines, they didn't roar. They glided into position like a machine operating on instinct. 2 peeled off toward the back entrance. 4 more parked at angles across the front of the diner, blocking every angle of approach. Others formed a perimeter down both sides of the street, engines going silent one by one, until the town was wrapped in a curtain of calm precision. Inside, Axel took a half-step back. He didn't even realize he'd done it. Stryker turned to the window, then turned back with his lips parted like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Hawk reached under his vest, then stopped himself. Ghost finally blinked. Blade muttered something under his breath that sounded a lot like regret. Sarah stood, smooth, unhurried. She placed both hands flat on the table and looked Axel in the eye. 10 minutes, she said softly. That's all it took. The bell above the door rang again. Not loud, just a soft chime, but it rang like a gavel. Colonel Jack Morrison stepped inside, his face lined by age and war, his posture straight as iron. He didn't need to speak. The presence was enough. But he did speak, and when he did, it was with the quiet finality of someone who'd led men through hell and brought some of them back. "This town," he said, voice low but unshakable, "doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who've earned it with blood, sacrifice, and the kind of courage you can't buy with a motorcycle and a jacket." Sarah didn't look back at him. She didn't need to. He was here. That was enough. And Axel Cross, who had swaggered in like a king, was about to learn what it meant to stand in the presence of warriors who didn't fight for pride, or power, or ego. They fought for something far more dangerous. They fought for each other. The air in the diner felt denser now, thick with the weight of history and purpose. The door had barely closed behind Colonel Morrison before the message became clear. even to the least perceptive of Axel's crew. This wasn't about numbers anymore. It wasn't about who had louder engines or more intimidating patches. It wasn't about territory in the way gangs understood it, marked corners and protection rackets. No, this was something else entirely. The men filing in behind Morrison didn't swagger, didn't sneer. They moved with the silent unity of people who had fought not for turf, but for survival. Not to dominate, but to defend. They wore no gang insignia, no colors screaming for attention. Just plain black jackets, many worn with age, some with faded emblems that only those who'd served would recognize. Unit badges, special forces tabs, a few sealed tridents. Quiet declarations of experience that didn't need explanation. Axel's mouth opened, but the words died in his throat. He was watching his narrative fall apart in front of him, unraveling thread by thread. These weren't cops he could intimidate or civilians he could scare. These were people who'd looked death in the eye on battlefields half a world away and survived. Some of them because of Sarah, some of them because of James. All of them because, once upon a time, someone like Sarah had made a decision to risk everything for someone else. And now they were here to return the favor. Colonel Morrison moved through the diner like he had every right to be there, which, in a way, he did. He nodded once at Betty, who gave the smallest, stunned return gesture, still clutching the same coffee pot like a lifeline. He looked at James, nodded again. Respect, recognition, gratitude, and then he turned toward Axel. "You picked the wrong diner," Morrison said. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The stillness in the room magnified every syllable. "And the wrong man, but mostly you picked the wrong woman to threaten." Axel's jaw tensed. His pride, so carefully cultivated and protected, was eroding in real time, and everyone in the room could feel it. "What are you?" he snapped, not quite managing to mask the tremor in his voice. "Some kind of mercenary retirement club?" One of the men behind Morrison stepped forward. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent more years in the desert than behind a desk. A ranger tab was stitched subtly on his shoulder. "We're something you wouldn't understand," he said. "We're what happens when someone who actually earned loyalty makes the call." Another man followed, tall, grey-bearded, silent until now. "We're what shows up when Sarah Mitchell says she needs backup. That's all you need to know." Axel took a step back, not retreating exactly, but repositioning, like someone suddenly unsure of the floor beneath him. Stryker looked to him for direction, but for once Axel had nothing. Hawk shifted his weight. Ghost stared hard at the floor. Even Blade, usually the first to smirk at any confrontation, now seemed unsure. Sarah finally moved from behind the booth. Her steps were quiet, precise, filled with the same discipline that had brought her through more than one mission with lives on the line. She walked straight up to Axel and stopped inches from him. "I warned you," she said, "and now I'm done warning." Axel forced a grin, but it was a poor imitation of confidence. "What, you think you're going to start something here, in front of all these people?" James's voice cut through the room like a rifle crack. "No, son, she won't start it." He stood slowly, unfolding to his full height. Even without his sight, James carried himself with the posture of command. The room quieted further, if that was possible. "But she will finish it. That's what you don't understand. She's not afraid of you, and we're not afraid of what happens next." The veterans had taken positions without speaking. A dozen men, each one now standing with clear lines of sight to the exits, to each gang member, to each other. They didn't speak in threats. They didn't posture. They were calm, measured, ready. Axel reached for the weapon tucked behind his waistband, barely perceptible, but Sarah had seen it from the moment he stepped through the door. She didn't wait. In a single, fluid motion, she stepped in, grabbed his wrist, twisted, and drove him down to the counter, his arm pinned behind his back, the weapon skidding across the floor and stopping near Ghost's feet. The other gang members barely had time to react before they realized the room had shifted entirely. Their leader, loud, defiant Axel, was face down against Betty's counter with Sarah's knee between his shoulder blades and his own weapon out of reach. Stryker moved, fast. His instincts took over before reason could catch up. He reached under his jacket, but before his hand found the grip of his blade, two veterans had flanked him. "No," one of them said firmly. "Don't." Stryker froze, his body tensed, breath heavy, eyes flicking toward Axel, who was grunting against the hold but saying nothing. The rest of the gang? Frozen. Ghost didn't move to pick up the gun. Instead, he looked at Sarah, really looked at her, for the first time. There was something in his eyes, not challenge, not defiance, something else. Recognition. Sarah leaned close to Axel's ear. "That gun you were reaching for? I counted it the second you walked in. I counted all of them. Stryker's blade, Hawk's sidearm. The brass knuckles Ghost thinks nobody noticed. Blade's switch tucked in his boot. You think you're walking into an ambush?" She paused. "No, Axel, you walked into a reckoning." She stood, letting him scramble to his knees. He didn't rise all the way. Not yet. Not while every veteran in the room had a clear line on him. Colonel Morrison stepped beside Sarah, his voice soft but filled with steel. "Do you understand what's happening here, Axel?" he asked. "Do you really? You didn't just threaten a blind veteran and his daughter. You insulted a family who represents everything we stand for, and you did it loud. So now we're answering loud." Axel stood slowly, swaying slightly, bruised in body and ego. "You think you win because you've got some old war stories and a bunch of retirees on bikes?" He spat, looking at the room with something between hatred and confusion. "You think that scares me?" "No," James said, calm as ever. "We don't need to scare you. We're here to show you something else. The difference between bullies and warriors. The difference between a gang and a brotherhood." That silence fell again, not because of fear this time, because of gravity, because even the night riders, hardened and angry as they were, could feel the weight of what was surrounding them. Sarah met Axel's eyes one last time. "You've got a choice," she said. "Leave now, while you still can, or stay and find out what happens when the people you thought were weak decide they've had enough." Outside, the sound of more engines grew closer. Not chaos, not noise. Discipline, order, more of them. The ones who'd fought beside Sarah and James in places the night riders couldn't pronounce. The reinforcements that weren't meant to intimidate but to protect. And the message was clear. This wasn't a gang war. This was a stand. And the war Axel thought he'd started, he'd already lost. Stryker shifted his weight, his boots scuffing slightly against the worn tile of the diner floor. He wasn't used to being still this long without a plan of action. Neither were the others. Hawk's eyes flicked from one veteran to the next, noting their calm postures, their silent coordination, the quiet nods exchanged like they'd already rehearsed this scene 100 times. Blade's fingers twitched near his belt buckle, where the hidden blade rested. But he didn't draw it. He didn't move, because even he knew something had changed, something big. The power in the room wasn't coming from the biggest guy or the loudest voice anymore. It came from the stillness, the certainty, and from Sarah Mitchell's quiet control. Outside, the parking lot was no longer just a row of bikes belonging to the night riders. Now it was a battlefield of contrast. On one side, the gang's chrome and flame decals glared in the autumn sun. On the other, the newly arrived veterans had parked their bikes in neat formation. There were no flashy paint jobs or skull designs, just steel, black, matte, worn from use, functional, purposeful. These weren't bikes for show. They were for going places no one wanted to be, doing things no one else could do. And now those riders had come here, not to fight for territory, but for someone who once led them through fire and made it out alive. Sarah stood tall, arms crossed now, eyes never leaving Axel. But there was no smugness in her face. She wasn't gloating. She was evaluating, measuring the next move before it happened. She saw the flickers of hesitation ripple through the gang like a wave, muscles tightening, jaws clenching, eyes scanning for exits. It was the same look soldiers had when they realized they were outgunned, outflanked, and out of time. Then came the moment that pushed everything past the point of return. Axel growled low in his throat and stepped forward. "You think this ends here?" he spat, voice shaking with rage more than confidence. "You think just 'cause a bunch of war fossils rolled in, we're gonna drop to our knees?" He gestured toward the front windows, where the veteran riders stood watching, silent and unmoving. "This is our town now. These streets answer to us." James Mitchell's voice sliced through the tension like steel against bone. "No," he said simply. "This town doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to its people, the ones who work, who raise families, who fight for peace when it'd be easier to choose violence." He paused, his blind eyes somehow seeing more than most of the gang ever had. "And some of us fought once already. We're not afraid to do it again." Axel's lip curled. "You keep talking like we're scared of you," he said, turning toward his men as if trying to summon their confidence. "We ain't scared. We're ready to go through anyone who stands in our way." But even as he said it, his voice faltered, because through the diner's windows the sounds began, low at first, then louder. More motorcycles, not the roar of the night riders' chaotic engines, but the synchronized hum of another wave of veterans arriving. They came from the North Road, the east entrance, even the back alley where the dumpsters used to be. They didn't block traffic. They didn't brandish weapons. They didn't have to. Their presence alone was enough to choke the bravado from any half-hearted threat. And they didn't arrive like attackers. They arrived like guardians. Sarah checked her watch, then looked up. 8 minutes, she said aloud, mostly to herself. They said 10. They were early. Betty had long since moved behind the counter, her hands no longer shaking. She gripped the edge of the formica as if steadying herself in the face of something enormous. For years she dealt with the night riders in silence, paid them off, refused to close shop, gritted her teeth through the threats. But this was different. She watched the transformation unfold in her own diner, watched the tide turn not with fists or bullets, but with purpose, with presence. Axel turned back to Sarah. "You think you've won just 'cause you made a call?" he barked. "That's all it takes for you people? Dial up some dusty soldiers and suddenly you think you own the town?" Sarah took a slow breath, then walked to the center of the diner. "No," she said. "We don't own anything. That's the difference between us and you. We don't need to own it to protect it." She turned to face the entire room, not just Axel now. She spoke to everyone, to Betty, to the regulars huddled behind the counter, to the gang, and to the veterans outside. This town has been living in fear for too long. Fear of what you might do, fear of speaking out, fear of going to the police who've been too afraid themselves. You wanted control through intimidation, but you forgot something. Axel scoffed. "What's that?" Sarah pointed to the veterans outside. "You forgot that some of us don't scare that easy." Right then, Ghost stepped forward. It was subtle, just one step, but it changed everything. All eyes went to him, because Ghost was one of their own, one of Axel's. And yet, he wasn't moving towards Sarah with aggression. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He stood still for a second, then looked at Axel and said quietly, "Something ain't right." Axel's head jerked toward him. "What?" Ghost looked around the diner, at the veterans, at James, at Sarah. "This ain't what we signed up for," he said. "This ain't brotherhood. This ain't strength. This is pride. Ego." He paused, voice strained like someone digging through a memory they hadn't wanted to revisit. "That woman, she pulled my squad out of an ambush in Helmand. I remember her. I never saw someone fly like that under fire. We owed her then, still do." Silence dropped like a hammer. Ghost's voice had cracked a seam in the gang's unity, and the others felt it. Stryker looked uncertain now. Blade shifted closer to the wall. Hawk frowned and took a small step back. Axel turned on Ghost, rage rising. "You shut your mouth!" "No," Ghost cut him off. "I ain't shutting nothing anymore." Sarah didn't speak. She didn't need to. Outside, the last of the veteran bikes parked in place. Every exit was now covered, not to trap, but to protect. Inside, the standoff stretched on. But something had changed. It wasn't just numbers anymore, it was conviction. And Axel could feel it. For the first time since he rolled into Eagle's Ridge, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't in control. He wasn't the apex predator in the room. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outmatched, not by a gang, but by something far more dangerous, by people who remembered what they'd once sworn to protect and finally decided it was time to stand. Outside, the sound of idling motorcycles formed a low, steady growl, more like a warning than a roar. Inside, no one moved. Not the night riders, not the veterans, not the townspeople frozen behind tables and counters. Tension had given way to something else now, anticipation, the kind that grips you before a storm breaks. But unlike a storm, this wasn't just nature's wrath. This was human choice, and the next move would decide everything. Axel stood in the center of it, fists clenched so tight the skin over his knuckles had gone white. His eyes were wild, scanning the room for a way to reclaim the upper hand, but there was none. The door was behind him. The veterans were in front of him. Sarah and James stood to his right, calm, unflinching, like anchors holding fast in rising tide. And to his left, the thing he hadn't expected, his own men, silent, uncertain, unraveling. Ghost remained rooted in place, his shoulders squared not toward Sarah, but toward Axel now, a quiet defiance in his stance. He didn't need to say anything more. His decision had been made. His choice was clear. Stryker had yet to move, but the hesitation in his eyes said enough. He was torn. His loyalty to Axel, a man who had once pulled him from the street and given him a role, was crumbling under the weight of everything unfolding in front of him. Blade wasn't looking at anyone. His eyes were fixed on the floor, jaw clenched, breathing shallow. Hawk was fidgeting, glancing toward the windows like he expected something worse to come through them, something darker than even this reckoning. What he saw out there wasn't just bikers. It was a force he couldn't understand. Not a gang, but something deeper, something earned. Sarah took a single step forward. One movement, but it felt seismic. "It doesn't have to go this way," she said, her voice calm but firm, each word laced with quiet steel. "You can walk out of here. You can take your people and leave this town. Leave these people in peace, or you can stay, and we all know how that ends." Her gaze never wavered. "You think you're standing on principle, but this isn't about respect anymore. It's about fear. Yours." Axel barked a bitter laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You're wrong. I'm not afraid." "You are," James said, not moving from his chair, his voice low and steady. "You're terrified, because for the first time in your life, you've met people who won't flinch when you raise your voice, people who won't kneel when you threaten them. You spent years convincing others you were a king. But now the throne is gone, and all that's left is a man grasping at smoke." Axel turned toward James, and for a second the room held its breath. Would he strike? Would he snap? But instead of violence, Axel's lips curled into something almost sad. "You think this is over?" he said, voice cracking just enough to betray the truth. "You think a bunch of old war dogs are going to save your town? You don't get it. This isn't just about me. This town is weak, always has been. You can scare me off today, but tomorrow, someone else will come. Another crew, bigger, badder. You can't stop the world from turning." "No," Sarah said softly, "but we can stop pretending we're helpless. That's where it starts." Outside, the sound of boots hitting pavement echoed from every direction. Veterans were stepping off their bikes, walking toward the diner, forming a human perimeter around it, not in aggression, not to surround or trap, but to shield. Their faces weren't angry. They were focused, determined. This wasn't a mission of revenge. This was a mission of protection. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted again. Not just tension now, not even confrontation. It was something heavier, a choice looming, waiting to be made. And it wasn't just Axel's to make. Stryker stepped forward. All eyes turned to him, the man who'd once broken a man's jaw for speaking out of turn, the enforcer, the fist of the Night Riders. But now he looked different, not smaller, but heavier, like the weight of everything he'd done had finally landed on his shoulders. He looked at Axel for a long moment and then shook his head. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered. "Not for threatening blind men, not for trying to scare a town into silence." His voice was gravel, low and tired. "You told us we were family, but you only meant it when we followed you without question." Axel stared at him, jaw working, but no words came out. Stryker turned toward Sarah. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I don't expect it, but I'm done." Slowly, he unzipped his jacket, reached inside, pulled out a patch, Night Riders, stitched in red and black, and dropped it on the floor. It didn't make a sound. Not really, but it echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Then Blade stepped forward, then Hawk, then two more from the back who'd stayed quiet the whole time. One by one, patches hit the floor. Some dropped them quietly, others held on a second longer, like they were shedding part of themselves they hadn't realized they wanted to let go of. The pile grew, red and black, embroidered symbols of intimidation and fear, now reduced to discarded fabric on a diner floor. Axel looked around. His crew, his brothers. They weren't his anymore, not in the way he'd convinced himself they were, and in that moment, whatever remained of his power evaporated. He stood in the middle of the room, suddenly alone, a man surrounded by people he had once led, now united against him by the same thing he'd always feared most, conscience. "You broke them," he whispered, eyes flashing toward Sarah, bitter with disbelief. "You broke my crew." "No," she said. "You already did. They just finally realized it." Ghost took a deep breath and stepped up beside Stryker. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded once to James, then looked Axel in the eye. "It's over," he said. "Let it go." And for a long beat, the room held its breath. Would Axel fight? Would he lunge? Would pride override survival? But all he did was lower his head. Outside, the veterans began to disperse slightly, forming a line between the diner and the street. Not a wall, but a path, a way forward. "You've got two choices," Sarah said, voice low. "Walk out that door, or we walk you out. But either way, this ends now." Axel said nothing. His hands hung at his sides. His face, once the face of fear in Eagle's Ridge, was now a mask of rage crumbling into something closer to grief. And then he turned, shoulders hunched, boots dragging slightly. He walked to the door, shoved it open, and stepped into the daylight. He didn't look back. And in that silence, Betty exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. James leaned back slightly in his chair, the cane resting across his lap like a sword sheathed in peace. Ghost looked at Sarah, then at the pile of patches on the floor and said, "So what now?" Sarah didn't smile, not yet. "Now," she said, "we rebuild." Outside the diner, a breeze picked up, cool, steady, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and autumn leaves. But the real scent in the air wasn't just from nature or Betty's kitchen. It was the scent of change, a kind of electricity that comes not from the threat of violence, but from the release of something long held back. Fear had broken. The illusion of control Axel had wielded like a blade was gone, lying in the same pile as the gang patches discarded on the floor. The Night Riders weren't a gang anymore. They were just men. Men facing the aftermath of their own choices, standing in the ruins of the image they'd tried to build. And for the first time, most of them weren't running from it. They were standing still, staring it in the face. Inside, Sarah remained near the booth where James sat calmly, his hands resting on the smooth tabletop, fingers lightly brushing the rim of his coffee cup. His expression hadn't changed since Axel left. Unflinching, focused, and strangely serene, the kind of calm that didn't come from confidence, but from experience, from knowing what chaos felt like and being unafraid of it. Sarah scanned the room again, not from anxiety, but from habit. The veterans still lined the parking lot, forming a barrier not of walls, but of watchful eyes and ready hands. Their job was done for now, but they didn't move, didn't relax, because they understood the truth. Victories weren't declared in a moment, they were proven over time. Ghost stood near the front counter, his jacket still unzipped, the space where his Night Rider's patch once sat now blank, empty. He looked smaller somehow, though not in stature. It was something in his posture, less aggressive, less armored. He had dropped the weight of who he used to be, and the absence left him exposed, not weak, but raw. Real. Stryker stood beside him, arms crossed, head down, as if bracing for whatever came next. Blade sat in the corner, quiet, eyes on the floor. No one was speaking yet. It was the silence after the detonation, where ears ring and hearts pound and no one knows quite what to do next. Then Betty moved. She stepped around the counter and bent slowly, picking up the patches from the floor one by one. She didn't rush. She didn't say a word. Her hands, aged and familiar, gathered each symbol of the gang's past, like she was collecting shards of glass. Deliberate, gentle. When she stood again, her gaze swept the room, and for the first time in a long while, there was no fear in her eyes, only strength. "These," she said, holding the bundle of cloth in her hand, "don't mean anything anymore, but they can still remind you what you left behind." She looked at Ghost, then Stryker, then each of the others. "If you're really done with this life, you don't just drop the patch. You have to replace it with something better." No one spoke for a moment. Then Ghost stepped forward. "We don't know how," he admitted, and his voice wasn't weak, it was honest. "Most of us, we joined because we didn't have anything else. No purpose, no family. We were just drifting, and Axel gave us something, even if it was the wrong thing." James lifted his chin. "Then maybe it's time to build the right thing." The weight of that statement settled over everyone. Building something right, not just leaving behind what was wrong, but forging a future worth staying for. That was harder. That took more than just walking away. That required facing people you'd hurt, earning back trust brick by brick, choice by choice. It meant not just changing how the world saw you, but how you saw yourself. Sarah folded her arms and leaned slightly on the table. "You've got a choice," she said. "You all do. You can walk out of here and disappear, start over somewhere else, pretend none of this ever happened, or you stay. You own what you did, and you help rebuild what you helped break." Stryker's voice was rough. "And if we stay, what then? Nobody here wants us around." "Maybe not," Sarah replied. "But that doesn't matter. Wanting doesn't change the truth. You were part of tearing this place down. Now you can be part of building it up. And when you build something with your own hands, with your sweat and your time, you don't walk away from that. You protect it. You value it." A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, but heavy with thought. Then Ghost looked at Stryker. "What if we did it different this time?" he said. "No fear, no threats, no colors, just purpose, a mission, like the old days, but real. Something worth fighting for that doesn't leave blood on the pavement." Blade looked up for the first time. "Like what?" And from that question, an idea started to take shape. Sarah didn't smile, but there was something in her voice. Hope, maybe, or something close to it. "Betty's diner stays open late for folks who need a place to sit and breathe," she said. "Start there. Clean up the alley. Help Mike from the post office. Fix that fence the gang busted last month. Drive deliveries for Mrs. Henderson when her knee acts up. Small things, the kind that show people who you are now, not who you used to be." James added, "And when they doubt you, and they will, you don't defend your past. You let your actions speak louder than any apology." From the window they saw a few town residents slowly approaching, cautious but curious. The news was spreading fast. Word of Axel's departure, of the Night Rider's collapse, of the strange, unbelievable fact that some of them were still standing here, unchanged in appearance, but unrecognizably different in spirit. The ones watching from across the street weren't angry, not yet, but they weren't trusting either. They were waiting, watching, measuring. "Let them watch," Sarah said quietly. "They have every right to. Let them see who you become. Outside, the veterans hadn't moved. They were still holding the line, but now some of them had stepped closer to the diner's entrance, not to guard it, but to witness what was happening inside, to be part of it, to support it, not with weapons or threats, but with quiet presence, the kind of backing that tells you, without a word, you're not alone. Stryker finally exhaled. We start now? You started the second you dropped that patch, Betty said. Then she turned to the coffee pot, as if that settled it. Ghost chuckled softly, the sound awkward and unfamiliar on his lips. Guess we've got work to do. Sarah nodded. Yeah, you do. And in that moment something shifted, not in a dramatic or sudden way, but like the turning of a tide, the fall of something dark, the beginning of something difficult but real. Outside, the wind blew through the trees. Inside, chairs scraped the floor as former gang members got up, not to walk out, but to walk forward. For the first time in a long time, Eagles Ridge didn't feel afraid. It felt ready. The morning after was different. It wasn't loud, it wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, almost reverent. The kind of quiet that settles over a place when something important has just happened and no one wants to be the first to break it. Eagles Ridge had held its breath for too long, and now, even with Axel gone and the Night Riders disbanded, no one was quite sure what came next. But something was stirring beneath the surface, a slow shift, like the cracking of old ice. And that shift began where it always had, at Betty's diner. Sarah arrived early, before most of the town had opened its eyes. She parked her truck in the same spot she always did, helped her father out, and guided him up the familiar ramp to the front door. The chill in the air hinted at the change of seasons, but it wasn't just weather. Inside, the diner looked the same. Tables lined up, napkin holders polished, the faint smell of coffee lingering from the night before. But the feeling was different. It wasn't just a place to eat anymore. It was a monument to what had happened, what had started. The counter was no longer just a place to order food. It was the spot where fear had been challenged, where James Mitchell had stared down, a man who thought violence could silence dignity. And now it was where the future was starting to show up. Ghost was already there, seated at a table near the window, not in leathers, but in a clean work shirt and boots. He looked restless, hands wrapped around a mug that had probably gone cold an hour ago. When he saw Sarah and James come in, he stood without thinking, something respectful in the motion that hadn't been there before. "Morning," he said, and his voice wasn't gruff or defensive. It was careful, deliberate, like he knew every word mattered now. James gave a small nod. Sarah offered a quiet, "Morning," back. Betty moved behind the counter with the ease of someone who had been doing it her whole life, but today there was a new energy in the way she poured coffee, the way she greeted Ghost with a simple, "You're early." No edge, no suspicion, just truth. Others began to arrive in twos and threes, former Night Riders, not all of them, but enough to matter. They didn't come swaggering in. They came like people unsure of their place but ready to earn one. Stryker carried a bucket and mop. Hawk had a toolbox. Blade brought his own broom. Not a word was exchanged about the tools. They just got to work. Tables were wiped, scuffed floors cleaned, the diner's sidewalk swept clean. It wasn't about the mess, it was about what it meant to clean it up. Actions, not apologies. Across town, similar scenes were unfolding. Mrs. Henderson's flower shop had its front window repaired by the same men who'd shattered it 3 months before. Tom from the hardware store accepted a delivery from Ghost and Stryker, this time without a protection fee, just a receipt and a thank you. People noticed. They watched from behind curtains, from parked cars, from behind shop counters. They saw men who used to terrify them carrying crates and loading shelves, heads down, movements steady, no colors, no patches, no posturing, just work. At the community center, Morrison had set up a temporary command post where veterans met to organize what came next. It was no longer about defense, it was about building. Ghost stood there mid-morning, flanked by Blade and Stryker, presenting a rough plan drawn on graph paper, outlines for a new facility that would serve as a training hub, job center, and shelter for at-risk veterans. "We know what they need," Ghost had said, "because we were them." Morrison listened. He didn't speak much, but when he nodded, you could feel the weight behind it. Word spread, not by flyers or announcements, but through stories. Mike at the post office told a neighbor about Ghost helping load mail crates. Betty shared that Blade had stayed late after his shift, scrubbing graffiti from the alley behind her diner. Sarah overheard kids on bikes whispering that Hawk had helped fix the old basketball hoop in the park, without being asked, and little by little, the line between fear and trust began to blur. The town council called an emergency meeting to discuss the future of Eagles Ridge. Sarah, Morrison, and several of the reformed gang members were invited. It was tense at first. Old wounds opened easily when pressed. Palmer, one of the loudest critics, stood and demanded to know why they should believe anything had really changed. Sarah didn't speak immediately. Instead, she stood aside and let Ghost answer. "Because we're not asking you to forget," he said. "We're showing you we remember every mistake, every harm, and we're doing what we can to make it right." It wasn't eloquent, it wasn't polished, but it was real, and real is what moved people. By the end of the meeting, the council voted to allow the Veterans Program to expand. Funds were approved for the transformation of the old Night Riders clubhouse into a resource center. Volunteers began to show up. Local carpenters offered materials. Retired teachers donated time for literacy programs. Counselors reached out from neighboring towns. The cracks in the town's unity were starting to heal, not through speeches, but through service. At the diner, the booths were full again, not with fear, but with conversation. Veterans laughed with civilians. Former gang members poured coffee and cleared plates. Betty put a new chalkboard sign in the window. "All are welcome, if you're here to help." No one argued with it. Later that day, Sarah stood outside with Ghost, watching traffic roll down Main Street, the sun casting long shadows on the pavement. "You think it'll hold?" Ghost asked, squinting into the light. Sarah didn't answer right away. She looked across the street where Stryker was helping repaint the community bulletin board, where kids once avoided walking past. "That depends," she finally said, "on whether you keep showing up tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that." Ghost nodded slowly. "We will." "Good," she said, "because people don't need a single moment of courage. They need 1,000 small ones, over and over." As evening settled in, Eagles Ridge felt different, still quiet, still cautious. But this time it wasn't fear, it was reflection, recovery. The kind of peace that's not born out of victory, but out of work, hard, necessary, unglamorous work. And as the lights came on in the diner, as laughter returned to the corners of Betty's walls, and as patches remained folded away in drawers rather than stitched back on jackets, it became clear redemption hadn't been declared. It was being lived, one act, one step, one day at a time. It started the same way every good change does, with a question. Not a loud one, not shouted from rooftops or printed in the papers, but whispered, hesitated, almost afraid of the answer. "Do you think it'll last?" Betty asked it quietly, almost to herself, as she refilled the sugar dispensers near the counter. Her hands moved with the same practiced ease as always, but the pause in her voice made Sarah look up. It was early. The diner was half full. Ghost and Stryker were in the corner booth, going over a list of cleanup projects. Morrison sat near the door, sipping coffee while reviewing notes for a call with a neighboring town. James sat by the window, facing the morning sun, like he always did. And yet, despite the activity, there was something delicate in the air. Like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if the change they'd built had taken root, or if it had just been a temporary calm after a long storm. Sarah answered slowly, her voice low. "That depends. On them, on us, on whether we keep choosing to believe it's possible." She looked out the window, watching a pair of former night riders, now wearing bright yellow volunteer vests, guide traffic around a pothole repair team. A few months ago, they would have been the reason for the damage. Now, they were part of the repair. It wasn't flashy, It wasn't fast, but it was real. Across town, the old Night Riders clubhouse had been stripped to its foundation. What once stood as a monument to control, intimidation, and violence had been gutted, cleaned, and repurposed. In its place rose a structure that still bore the bones of its past, but now echoed with new intent. Inside, classrooms were being painted. A counseling room had been set up with donated furniture. The smell of sawdust and fresh paint filled the air, mixing with coffee brewed by volunteers and the quiet murmur of planning. Ghost had taken charge of the logistics. Blade managed scheduling. Hawk, who once specialized in smuggling and escape, now organized job placement programs. Even the quiet ones, the hangers-on, the shadows, had found purpose. They repaired, they built, they stayed, and every nail driven into the new walls drove home one truth deeper. Redemption wasn't given. It was earned. One morning, a group of teenagers approached the center, not troublemakers but kids on the edge. The kind of kids who used to idolize the wrong people, wear fake patches, draw symbols on their backpacks. They didn't say much, just hung around the edge of the lot, watching. But instead of being chased away, they were invited in. Ghost handed them paintbrushes. "You want to help?" he said. "This wall's yours." The boys looked at him, at the center, at each other. Then they picked up the brushes and went to work. When they left that afternoon, their expressions had changed. Less bravado, more quiet pride. A few came back the next day, and the one after that. By the end of the week, Sarah had received a report from Sheriff Wilson, not about a crime or a disturbance, but a thank you. "I've been doing this a long time," he said over coffee one evening, leaning across the booth. "You don't get many stories like this, people turning it around. Whole towns shifting like tectonic plates." He tapped his cup thoughtfully. "But you want to know the part that gives me hope. It's not just the Night Riders who changed, it's everyone else. It's Tom from the hardware store hiring Ghost. It's Mrs. Henderson letting Blade fix her roof. It's Palmer, grumpy as he is, donating wood to rebuild the park bench his bank used to refuse to fund." He shook his head, half smiling. "People always think strength is loud, but this is the quiet kind, the steady kind, the kind that lasts." One afternoon, they held an open house at the new community center. They didn't expect much, just a few curious neighbors, but people came, dozens, families, business owners, teenagers, veterans. Some came with cautious curiosity, others with hesitant optimism. They toured the classrooms. They listened to Morrison talk about veteran transition programs. They saw photos of the renovations, before and after shots that showed just how far things had come. And then, in one of the back rooms, they found the wall. It hadn't been announced. No speeches, no ceremony, just a wall, painted dark with dozens of small silver nameplates bolted to it. Each plate bore a name, not of a donor, not of a sponsor, but of a person who had turned their life around. At the bottom of the wall, a simple phrase, "Not who we were, who we chose to become." James had insisted on that line. Sarah remembered the day he said it. "You can't rewrite the past," he'd told her, "but you can write what comes next. That's what matters." And the stories did keep coming next. Other towns called, sent delegates, asked questions. How did you do it? How do you keep them from slipping back? How did you get your community to believe again? Morrison answered every call. Ghost began traveling, sharing the model, showing others how to spot veterans in trouble before they disappeared into gangs or crime. Stryker helped set up a vocational program in a neighboring town. Blade organized peer mentorship with local high schools. Sarah stayed in Eagles Ridge, watching, guiding, protecting, always alert. But not everything went smoothly. One of the reformed riders slipped, got drunk, picked a fight. It was bad, not criminal, but public enough to cause a ripple. The council panicked. Palmer started talking again. Headlines flirted with drama, and for a moment it seemed like the fragile peace might crack. But something different happened. Ghost stepped forward, not to defend or excuse, but to own it. He held a press meeting. "This is what real change looks like," he said, standing beside the young man. "It's messy, it's hard, sometimes people fall, but when they do, we don't bury them in shame. We help them back up." The town didn't erupt. It held, because by now they'd seen too much to believe one mistake undid everything else. That night, the diner was full again. Laughter returned, and not the nervous kind. Sarah sat beside her father, watching Stryker tell a story that had Betty in tears from laughing. And when she looked around, really looked, she didn't just see reformed gang members or cautious townsfolk. She saw something more. She saw a community that had remembered how to trust, that had chosen to rebuild instead of retreat, that had stopped waiting for someone else to fix things and had become the fix themselves. James reached for his coffee. "Told you they'd come around," he said with a small smile. Sarah leaned back, finally letting herself exhale. They didn't just come around. They rose. And that was the truth of it. Eagles Ridge didn't just survive the storm. It didn't just recover. It became a blueprint, a promise, a proof that the hardest battles aren't fought with fists or fire, but with forgiveness, consistency, and the relentless choice to be better than yesterday. The Night Riders were gone, but what took their place was something no gang could ever match. A community built on second chances, a town held together not by fear, but by the fierce, unshakable belief that no one was too far gone to come home. And in the glow of the diner's windows, over fresh coffee and familiar voices, that belief grew stronger with every sunrise.